Crewman Tommy here. Question: when does Star Trek stop being believable? Let's talk about something that's been bothering a lot of Trek fans lately. And no, this isn't another argument about whether modern Trek is better or worse than classic Trek. I want to talk about something more fundamental. What makes Star Trek believable? Now, before somebody jumps into the comments and says, Star Trek isn't supposed to be believable. I agree. Of course it isn't. Star Trek has warp drive. It has transporters, phasers, time travel, alternate dimensions, telepathy, wormholes, antimatter, engines, and aliens that look like humans with different foreheads. None of that is believable by today's scientific standards. And yet, we believe it. Why? Because Star Trek's been very good at something called suspension of disbelief. The audience doesn't have to believe that something could happen in the real world. We only have to believe that it could happen within the Star Trek world. And that's where I think we have an interesting comparison between two transporter accidents separated by more than 30 years. One is the Next Generation's Season 6 episode, Rascals. The other is Strange New World Season 4 episode, Level 5 Transporter Accident, which we will hereforth note as the Puppet episode. And these two episodes provide an almost perfect case study for the question, when does Star Trek stop being unbelievable because the science is impossible and start being unbelievable because the story itself has abandoned any logic? Let's go back to 1992. In Rascals, Captain Picard and friends are returning to the Enterprise aboard a shuttle. They encounter an energy field. The shuttle's damaged. The Enterprise attempts an emergency transport. Something goes very, very wrong. The transporter reports a 40% drop in mass. 4 adults materialize as children. Now stop right there. Is that scientifically possible? No, none of it is, not remotely. But here's the important part. The episode doesn't simply say, transporter accident, they're kids now, moving on. No, the writers actually attempt to establish a mechanism where Dr. Crusher examines Picard, discovers something fascinating. His DNA hasn't been rewound. His genetic structure is still fundamentally his own. Crusher explains that a developmental component called RVN has lost sequences associated with physical maturation during puberty. The episode's explanation is essentially the transporter accident altered the biological state of their bodies without erasing their adult memories, intelligence, or personalities. That's ridiculous science. But it's Star Trek ridiculous science, and that's an important distinction. Because once the writers establish the rules, the rest of the episode follows those rules. Picard is still Picard, Ro is Ro, Guinan's Guinan, Keiko is Keiko. They have adult memories, adult intelligence, adult personalities, but their bodies have been physically regressed. And the episode consistently explores the consequences of that condition. Now let's look at the Puppet episode. Fast forward to 2026. Scotty's experimenting with the transporter. He attempts to transport his toy puppet to a school adversary. Something goes wrong, and suddenly most of the Enterprise crew have been transformed into puppets. Not people who look like puppets, not miniature humans, not holographic representations. Actual puppets, felt, foam, tiny puppet bodies, and yet they retain their personalities, memories, speech, and consciousness. They're essentially the same people, but now they're Muppets. And here's where I think the debate gets interesting, because someone can quite reasonably say, what's the difference? Rascals did the exact same thing. Picard became a child, Pike became a puppet. Both were caused by transporter accidents. Both retain their memories, both retain their personalities. So why is one acceptable Trek science fiction while the other feels like a cartoon? I think the answer is the transformation itself isn't the deciding factor. The deciding factor is internal plausibility. Impossible doesn't mean unbelievable. Think about it. If I tell you tomorrow the Enterprise encounters a temporal anomaly that causes every crew member to age backwards, you might say, okay, that's ridiculous. But then I explain, the anomaly is producing a localized temporal inversion. The transporter patterns are interacting with the field, causing the subject's biological states to revert to earlier temporal configurations. You might still say, that's ridiculous. And I'd agree, but you might also say, okay, I understand what they're trying to tell me. That's suspension of disbelief. And I'm not believing that it's real. I'm accepting that within this fictional universe, the writers have established a mechanism that could produce the result. And Rascals does exactly that. The transporter didn't simply press a magic make younger button. The episode gives us an energy field, a transporter malfunction, a measurable mass change, biological testing, and a specific explanation for the altered physical development. The science is fictional, but the logic is consistent. Now consider the puppet transformation. And here's where my criticism of the puppet episode comes in. And I want to be fair. The episode had its funny moments. The puppets are awesome. They're beautifully made. Jim Henson's Creature Shop work is fantastic. And the producers have openly embraced the fact that this was intended to be a deliberately silly episode. Showrunners have even defended the approach by pointing to the trouble with tribbles and arguing that silliness has always been part of Trek's history. So my criticism isn't Star Trek isn't allowed to be funny. That's nonsense. Star Trek has always been funny. It's extremely funny. My criticism is, what are the rules of the fictional universe that allow a human being to become a living puppet? Because here's the problem. A human body is made of cells. Cells contain molecules. Molecules contain atoms. A puppet is an artificial object made from materials like cloth, foam, and other manufactured components. So when the transporter supposedly converts a human being into a puppet, what exactly happened to the person's biological matter? Where did the cells go? Where did the organs go? What happened to the nervous system? What happened to the brain? What happened to the circulatory system? What happened to the chemical processes? Because in Rascals, the characters remain biological organisms. Their bodies are altered, but they're still biological beings. In the puppet episode, we're talking about something fundamentally different. The characters appear to have crossed the boundary between living biological matter and manufactured material, and that's a much bigger leap. But here's the twist, where I have to give the episode credit. The episode eventually reveals that the puppet adventure is tied to Spock's transporter experience and ultimately occurs within his mind rather than being an actual permanent transformation of the Enterprise crew. And that changes the argument, because technically, Star Trek didn't establish that the Enterprise crew can be transformed into Muppets by a transporter. The puppet universe is not necessarily a new physical rule of Star Trek. It's a surreal experience, a dreamlike sequence. And that's a perfectly legitimate storytelling device. Star Trek's done that before. We've had altered realities, hallucinations, dream states, telepathic experiences, temporal distortions, false realities, characters experiencing entire lifetimes within their minds. So if someone says the puppet transformation isn't a violation of canon because it never literally happened, that's a legitimate argument. But there's still a problem. The audience has to live in the story before the reveal. For most of the episode, we're asked to accept the puppet reality as though it's actually happening. We're watching the Enterprise crew function as puppets. We're watching them interact with their environment. We're watching them fight pirates. We're watching them use their altered physical characteristics to solve problems, and we're being encouraged to understand the rules of this puppet reality. Then comes the reveal. It wasn't actually happening. And that's perfectly valid storytelling, but it changes the type of science fiction we're watching. We're no longer asking, how could this happen in Star Trek? We're asking, what does this experience mean to Spock? And those are two very different storytelling objectives. That's the real difference. And this brings me back to the larger argument. I don't think the difference between classic Trek and modern Trek is science versus fantasy. That's too simplistic. I think the difference is increasingly internal logic versus narrative spectacle. Classic Trek routinely asked, what happens if we discover a new life form? What happens if our technology creates an unexpected problem? What happens if the Prime Directive conflicts with our morality? What happens if an alien phenomenon changes our biology? And then the writers built a story around answering those very questions. Modern Star Trek sometimes starts with a different question. Wouldn't it be crazy if everyone became puppets? Or, wouldn't it be crazy if everyone broke into song? Wouldn't it be crazy if the crew suddenly entered a cartoon? Wouldn't it be crazy if we turned this episode into a completely different genre of film? And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with experimentation, but there is a danger because once crazy becomes the objective, the rules of the universe can become secondary to the gimmick. And that's what I mean when I talk about conceptual drift. Imagine Star Trek gradually moving the boundary of what the audience is expected to accept. First, transporter accident causes biological regression. Okay. Then, transporter accident causes unusual physical mutation. Okay. Then, transporter accident changes the nature of matter. Okay. Then, transporter accident turns people into something completely unrelated to their biological existence. Okay. Then, don't worry about explaining it. It's funny. And eventually, the audience stops asking, how does this work? Because they've learned that the answer doesn't matter. And that to me is the real danger. Not one silly episode, not one puppet episode, not one musical episode. It's the gradual erosion over time of the expectation that Star Trek needs to establish believable rules for its own universe. So let me ask you, which one is more believable? Picard becoming 12 years old or Pike becoming a puppet? You know my answer. Not because Picard becoming 12 is scientifically possible. It isn't. It's because Rascals establishes a fictional mechanism that allows us to understand the transformation. The episode gives us an anomaly. It gives us a transporter consequence. It gives us measurable physical changes. It gives us medical analysis. It gives us a biological explanation, and then it explores the consequences. That's science fiction. It's speculative. It's impossible, but it's internally coherent. The puppet episode's different because its transformation is fundamentally absurd unless we treat the entire thing as a surreal experience rather than a real physical event. And once we do that, we're no longer debating transporter science. We're debating symbolism, character development, comedy. That's perfectly legitimate television, but it's a different kind of television, not Star Trek. So maybe the question isn't, is modern Star Trek too unrealistic? Because let's be honest, Star Trek's never been realistic. The better question is, does Star Trek still give us enough reality inside the fiction to make us believe the fiction? Because that's the magic of science fiction. I don't need to believe that warp drive is real. I don't need to believe that transporters are real. I don't need to believe that Vulcans are real or that the Federation could actually exist. But when I sit down to watch Star Trek, I want to believe that the people inside that universe believe in the rules of their own universe. It's a lot of universes. That's suspension of disbelief. And once the audience realizes that the rules can change whenever the writers need them to, the magic starts to disappear. Because the question stops being, what could happen next? And becomes, what ridiculous thing are they going to do next? And those are two very different questions. Well, there you have it. I'm Crewman Tommy. Don't forget to tune in every Sunday night. Catch us live, me, Magix, and PVG, for the Technically Trek podcast. Computer, end program.